Awesome. Awesome. All right. I'm seeing requests. Yes, you absolutely can. It's hard for me to keep track of things in the Zoom that I'll have to do later. So just send me an email right now, just in case you're wondering if she's talking to me. There are at least 5 people asking about either today's quiz or a quiz in the past. So just go ahead and send me an email and I'll have those reset and you guys will have until probably Sunday night. I'll just open it up. So if that's something that any quiz for any week, if you want to reset, just send me a request and that will be taken care of today. And if not today, it'll be done by tomorrow and you'll have until Sunday, no matter what. If you have a current quiz that's been reopened, you have until the end of Friday. Not a problem. It's really, honestly, for me, the easiest thing is just to do them in batch form. And so just send me the email. And then usually, if you guys wonder, uh, you're like, God, it was such a you're like, God, did she send that email to other people? I might have. If it's the same kind of email, thank you for your patience. I'm back in the office. You have access to the quiz to da da da. Those often get sent to about 8 to 10 students every time. So just go ahead and send those my way and we'll take care of it. Um, if you have questions about your essay, we are a teaching team. And so obviously, big thank you to Aaron for just hustling his way through those. But if you have questions, comments, concerns, always bring those to me and we just work them out together. And when in doubt, don't forget. I'll actually start screen sharing now because this is on one of the slides. Hold on. Excuse me. Let's see here. Sorry, where is it? There it is. So next week, like we know, is spring break. As I said, we're getting all the quizzes reset. Now, if you find yourself really stressing about your grade on the essay, um, as we've said, we're trying to make sure you guys come out of this class stronger writers, and so it's not unheard of. Although I will say, and you'll know who you are potentially. Hold on, guys, let's see here. Today sponsored by Cherry Pepsi. Uh-huh. Um, the impossible has happened. One of our students actually got a 30 out of 30 on this essay, which if memory serves, might be the first time that's happened, which I'm very excited about. So good work if you're out there, and just know that it is possible, and no matter what, the extra credit options rain down in this class. So just take a look at the syllabus if you have questions. But as a quick heads up, there will actually be even more chances, one more chance between now and the next time we come together. I'm going to be circulating an anonymous midterm evaluation link. It's going to be kind of like a SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, whatever is most user friendly, just to do the typical evaluation that I usually do in class. With the schedule this semester, I just don't think it makes sense to keep waiting on that for the next time I see you guys. And so what you'll be able to do is much like the final course evaluations at the end of the semester, when you get to the end, obviously it's anonymous, so I don't want to know anything you said or any of your comments therein. But the last page of any survey, right, always says, thank you for completing the survey, da, da, da. You can screenshot that and send it for 5 points extra credit. That will be released by Sunday as well. So hopefully you'll be able to take care of it by now. And the next time we come together, those 5 points will be eligible until the April 1st, when we come back formally. Awesome. Quick pause. Does anyone have any questions or comments, any announcements anything on spring break or on campus that people should know about, either before or during?
Yeah, we have our first women's water polo game here at home, our home opener, Saturday at 1 p.m. if y'all want to come out and support the women's team.
Awesome. Water polo, vicious sport, in a good way. I never knew, like, just the savagery under the water. But
Yeah, it's crazy.
it is. And it's crazy because the ref can't always see, so it's like a vicious synchronized swimming of sorts. Um, I do see some questions in the chat. Colloquium extra credit gets added. Extra credit always gets added in batch form. And so, because we have like a couple things trickle in through the beginning of the semester, I typically wrap them all up. So you'll be seeing a reply back in the next week that confirms your submission. If you haven't already, that's why no one has. You don't actually see it anywhere on your grade until the end of the semester when it's added to your final paper score, because the extra credit records are kind of maintained on my end. And so you get a cumulative amount added to your final paper. Um, and the evaluation form will be coming to you guys via CAT courses. I will post it as soon as that's available. So you don't have access to it yet, but you will soon. Thank you for those questions and announcements. Um, Now, I did want to stop briefly and hopefully if you guys watched it after class last time, this is actually, I don't want to be redundant, but it is an important enough video that I wanted to take a second to show what we tried to watch last time. It also lends itself really well to where we take the conversation today. Obviously, we know it takes two people to make a baby, and although there has been almost a morbid borderline voyeuristic fascination with both single mothers and the fathers of their children, there has been a real shortcoming in the literature up until recent years where we didn't really ask men. They just kind of assumed what men felt about children, childbirth, marriage in low income communities, as we knew kind of through the words of their partners, their moms, their sisters, the women in their lives. It wasn't until the last 15 years, give or take, where we saw fathers really benefit from that level of social inquiry. But nonetheless, this is very much a two-part story. My own work really builds in that vein, even though I start with fathers. Mothers are the next book, the next focus. But before we jump into today with a deep focus into dads, I do want to pause and hear a little more from Kathy Edin, who you guys know I'm a big fan of. And because we were listening earlier, I believe I've got that one thing figured out. But here we go. I will check in the chat. If you don't hear it, go ahead and let me know.
Most people who research the poor are middle class, and we bring our assumptions with us. This creates all sorts of problems for studies of poverty because usually those assumptions don't apply. And the history of policymaking is rife with examples of policy designers who got it wrong because they didn't know anything about poor people. In order to have good policy, you have to have good, in-depth, on the ground, get your hands dirty research. My family and I, my two little kids and my husband moved to America's most dangerous and poorest city, Camden, New Jersey. The conventional wisdom was that poor women had children to get more money from welfare. And they thought poor men were engaged in a status competition. They were showing off to their friends, how many women can I get? And the minute a girlfriend turned up pregnant, they would cut and run. There are ways of asking questions that allow you to quote unquote observe. You don't want to say, so why did you have this baby, right? You want to say, tell me the whole story. Put me on your shoulder like I'm a video camera. Take me with you through that experience so I can observe with you the course of your life. What we learned is that no mother was having more babies just to get welfare. You only got about $75 more in the first place, and everyone knew you couldn't raise a child on $75 a month. What these women were really about is crafting a sense of meaning and identity and a void. These communities, if you spend any time in Camden, New Jersey, are some of the darkest avenues in America. They see parenting is their highest calling. And what's fascinating is not only the women see parenting in this way, but also now the men. Men are seizing fatherhood, especially really disadvantaged men, with both hands. So the first young man we met when we moved to Camden was named Andre Green. He was still in high school when we interviewed him. He was already a father of a little girl, Jalissa. And when we asked him, tell me how you reacted the moment you heard Sonia was pregnant, he related the following story. So I was coming into my Aunt Cherlin's house. She greeted me at the door and she said, Andre, you know that girl Sonia used to date? And I said, yeah. What about her? And Cherlin said, she's pregnant. And then Andre says he slammed his fist on the counter, as if in anger, stomped up the stairs, slammed the door to the room he shared with his cousins, looks around to make sure no one else is in there. And then he says he begins dancing around the room, shouting, "Thank you, Jesus." He began to tell a story of that really exemplified what living in Camden was like. His brother had just been murdered. His mom had returned to drug addiction, which is rife in Camden. As a result, his stepfather couldn't get a job. There was no money in the house. Unemployment rate very high in the city. So in a community of so much negativity, a child is like a magic wand, but it's also, to vanquish the negativity, but it's also sort of a project, a quest, something you can throw yourself into. What a lot of people want to know is, yeah, kids bring meaning and joy in the short term, but what does it do for poverty, right? These kids are already so disadvantaged by the time they choose to have children that it doesn't affect their prospects very much. Now, it probably does affect the prospects of their kids. If parents would wait until they were a little older, it would probably benefit kids because they'd be better parents. However, when you're on a quest as a young person for meaning and identity, and our society gives you so little else to hold on to, no sense of a future in the labor market, school systems that are so deplorable they can't even be called bad. So while Americans might criticize the poor and say, well, the reason they're poor is they had these kids, they really only have 2.1 to 2.3 kids on average each. It's not like they're having 7 children. They're just having them young, and they're having them when they're economically unprepared. What if they had a sense that they had a brighter economic future? What if they thought that by their labor they could escape poverty? Might it be the case that they would make different and better decisions about their family lives if their economic lives had some hope?
Now, I want to, without too much preamble, I want to toss it over because there is obviously more to this discussion. There is, no matter what, we always have to realize that in some ways there is almost a, like, is this even our business? Should we be looking at this as a source or factor contributing to inequality? I think in many ways that's a very reasonable question. And I'll point to Kathy's response that in a lot of ways, having a child and rearing a child in these really disadvantaged communities is not in and of itself something that actually negatively impacts your own life outcomes, but it probably impacts the child. And so, in a lot of ways, this is part of that discussion of how do we right honor the agency and choices of individuals, but also appreciate how behaviors are both incentivized or disincentivized, right? And in this case, we're seeing that in some ways some of the disadvantage is not actually occurring to those making the choices, but rather almost a deferred disadvantage, if you will, because of the implications for the children born into these homes, right? Myself being one of them, even though we didn't come from an urban area, we were, now I'm gonna stop the screen share to toggle over. My family was not exactly, having just shown you my degrees, I can assure you that was not your average Harvard or Dartmouth background. And in some ways, the choices I made or the decisions not to do something, it was because in my mind the calculus was very much apparent that certain choices would close certain doors. But if you don't see those doors as being open to you in the first place, and actually can see the great meaning and joy that a child brings into anyone's life, you hope, right? Uh, you can see how that as a source of meaning would not only be special, but might even become more special because of the complete dearth of other sources of meaning or self-efficacy. Now, hearing more from the fathers themselves, we're going to kick it over to Kathy once again. Let's let the ad, my bad, guys.
Maybe running out of work above children, and I'd only spend more time with people who are not like us. We learn a lot about ourselves.
Kathryn, Edin, what about some of the economic circumstances that these young fathers and these children find themselves in?
It's not a good story. Young men have a very hard time attaching to the labor market. When you look at data that follows them over the life course, they're not really attaching to stable careers until their late 20s or even their 30s. And of course, the mean age at first birth for these men is about 22 or 23. So you may have a 7 to 10 year gap between when you, when you first have a child and when you're stably connected to the labor market. Part of that is a labor market problem. I've written elsewhere that we may be running out of work. There's also a degradation of work at the bottom. It's almost impossible to find full-time hours if you're not skilled. Really, anybody without a college education can be in real trouble. Criminal records make that worse. But it is a very hard, this economy is not working for unskilled men. Now, there are good policy prescriptions out there for drawing men into the labor market, particularly expanding the earned income tax credit, which has worked so well for drawing single mothers into the labor market. So we need to think more creatively about engaging men in work at the same time that they're transitioning to family life.
One of the things, one of your footnotes, you write, men don't qualify for many types of government assistance because they don't often have custody of their children. Custodial parents who meet income guidelines are eligible for housing subsidies, short-term cash welfare, a generous earned income tax credit, other benefits. Poor men without custodial children are sometimes eligible for modest short-term cash benefits from welfare, plus in-kind benefits. If they work, they're also eligible for a small EITC.
Yeah, so I would be the last person to say single mothers don't need help, right? They're the custodial parents of kids. But really, in a system where we only help women, now we're really providing significant aid to low-income moms who work. It's as much as they would have gotten from the welfare system in the old days, but we give it to them on top of their salaries so they can work and not be poor, right? Every time you help one gender without helping the other, you could destabilize these pairings even further. So oftentimes policymakers, in a drive to be thrifty or wise, say, well, it's the mother who's most important. But I think that's a perilous approach and could actually do harm. And we should always follow the rule of first doing no harm. We want every child in America to have two thriving parents who can be engaged, loving, and supportive throughout the life course. How do we get there? We've got to have equitable policies that benefit men as well as women. We're used to seeing a world where men get the goodies and women are shortchanged. But in this part of the income distribution, the story is very, very different, and the biases against men are strong.
Throughout your book, you talk about some of these young men who have minimum wage jobs, but they're not making enough, so they turn to selling drugs, they turn to crime.
Yeah, so
And it
that's
seems to be common.
it's a trap, right? So a lot of young men engage in, it's less common now, actually. It's becoming less and less common. We've got new evidence to show that as American cities become more peaceful. But in any case, selling drugs is often a stopgap measure. You get to a point in adolescence where your mom is really struggling economically, your girlfriend is struggling, and you're the guy who can provide. So, usually drug selling is limited to the early life course. Most young boys age out of it fairly quickly. Once a young man learns that he's going to become a father, the first thing he wants to do is get out of that trade because he wants to be a good role model to his kids. He wants a legitimate job. The drive for formal sector legitimate employment is very, very strong among these men. Virtually no one says, I'd rather be out dealing, right? It's an income smoothing strategy. It's not seen, if you're a drug dealer, you're a loser. You're not to use the parlance of young people in Baltimore, you're not about anything. You've failed to answer that critical question of who am I, because you're the loser out on the corner. So men don't want that. But when it comes to, buying those Christmas presents, when it comes, to seeing that eviction notice slipped under the door, it can be very tempting. And so involvement with drugs and with the criminal justice system is almost it's like a low-level fever that can crop up into pneumonia at any time, but it's pervasive, and it really drags men down. We don't have jobs of last resort in this country. Day labor sort of serves that function, but it's hard to get a day labor job. You can show up at 5 in the morning, as many of our fathers do. Many of our fathers approach 6 to 7 different day labor organizations in a day in an effort to find work, and may only work 2 or 3 days a week at minimum wage minus transportation costs. These jobs, sometimes I walk through my daily life and I see low-level service workers like the people I interview, and I wish that that I knew that everyone I interacted with over at Union Station or just out and about during the course of my day was making a living wage, but that's not true. Many of them are struggling to survive, and despite the ability and willingness to play by the rules and try to engage in formal sector work.
Another trend I saw in your book.
Now, let's see here. Screen share over to this guy. Now, I want to just pause and say that hopefully, kind of a theme that you're getting is what a privilege it is to actually be able to make personal choices. And that's it. That's the end of the sentence. Uh, because as we just heard Kathy describe, right, there is actually a huge joy, right, that comes from fatherhood. There is just as much meaning and purpose derived from that role, right? We know that men in Western society, right, as the provider, there is such an emphasis on the role of fathers with really specific expectations attached to it. And in the context of many overlapping constraints, whether that's the community you live in, the school you went to, the jobs you have access to, the way you're treated by because of the way your skin looks. That's it. Before you open your mouth, before you do anything that you personally can take ownership from, you know what it means to have different outcomes, to be deprived of outcomes, to be discriminated against because of the life, the skin, the community you were born into. That also includes some of the most intimate choices individuals make. Partnership, being in relationship with someone, love, childbearing, child rearing. These are all some of the kind of most intimate things that humans do, both personally and in community. And to fully feel that your choices are a reflection of what you want to do and not merely an accumulation of many negative circumstances, that's actually like a huge privilege, right? And I think even though in a lot of the work that has been done so far, right, we're looking at urban experiences. We're looking at largely black white comparisons. We're also looking at non custodial fathers, which is a really key point, which kind of brings us to the next slide. When we say non custodial fathers, I want you guys to kind of say in the chat, what does that mean? Uh, when someone's a non custodial parent, what does that, by definition, what would that mean? And they talked about how a lot of our social safety nets are associated with custody of children. If you're not the non-custodial parent, what would that look like? Feel free to say it in the microphone if you're really brave. Let's see here. Anybody? Anyone have a non-custodial parent? For example, maybe you had to fill out paperwork for FAFSA for your non-custodial parent. Yes, yes, there you go. Someone who doesn't have the custody, legal, physical. Now, there's many layers to custody technically, but if you're the non-custodial parent, you could very well still be responsible for uh, child support. You may still have to weigh in if the child, needs medical care, especially surgeries. Um, Typically you still are a part of those things, very much so, but you don't actually have the child in the home the majority of the time, right? And while we know there are non-custodial mothers and there are single fathers, there is generally a very gendered trend, of course, towards single mothers and non-custodial fathers. And this is where I would highlight that my work is actually somewhat of a departure, because I looked at fathers who were still actively custodians of their children. Now, some of them had been churning in and out of incarceration, some of them had been in and out of recovery, so their ability to show up as a full time, full present parent fluctuated. But I really personally, even though we're doing a better job of kind of asking fathers about their experiences in such places, I would say, as the daughter of someone who, by the time I was in college, that picture I showed you guys, that Blythe, her dad was living in the bushes because he was high on meth. He's been in recovery. He still really enjoys being outside. I'm not gonna lie. But I remember having to fill out something for financial aid, and I told them, you guys keep asking for his tax info or his pay stubs. My mom makes nothing. She's a big goose egg, zero. And you act like my dad might have something. Like, he lives in the bushes. I don't know where he's at, let alone his tax forms. Thank God they never asked again. But even though there was kind of an extreme time in that sense, my dad had, for the most part, been a constant presence in my life. Even when he faltered, I was still close to his family. I arguably, the extent to which non custodial fathers are still present in the lives of their children is obvious to anyone who may know such a father, either personally or through family. But our studies of them have been lacking. We sometimes just write them out of the story in a way that is, I think, probably inaccurate and at times offensive. And so I really appreciate the work of Kathy Edin and Tim Nelson, not just as a former student, but there's very few examples where people really ask fathers, non-custodial fathers, how they feel about the role they have in their children's lives. Um, they also um, they did it much like the work with mothers, right? If you'll recall the methods, maybe you can shout out in the chat what I always call it. It has to do with a shape that has three sides, but they did something with their interview data. So they did in-depth life history interviews, right? Last time we knew every person we talked to at least two times. Typically, you're thinking 2-3 hours each time, right? So that's 4 or more hours of audio per person with 107 fathers. They then went on to I don't think I see it. They went to triangulate. They triangulated it. Triangle. That's when you get multiple vantage points on your data point of interest. In this case, they wanted to make sure that what these dads were saying was really lining up with how they were showing up in their children's lives. So they once again conducted home observations and community participation. They actually went out of their way to go to kind of different cities in this time around. Obviously, Philadelphia, Camden, in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, that has been an area of inquiry for them. So they wanted to continue to make comparisons there. Chicago, we know Chicago is, the land of sociologists doing research, or at least the South Side has been quite generous in their ability to interact and let us learn from them. But then you have these other 2 points that we haven't actually seen in any studies before now: Boston, Massachusetts, and Charleston, South Carolina. Obviously, Charleston's a pretty big city down in that part of the world, but in both of these efforts, they were trying to look at a city that may operate or have different mechanisms at play than the cities we've previously studied. And looking at a city in the South that is in an arguably more rural area, that too could add texture to this experience that we might not capture if we were to just focus on the New Yorks of the world, the Phillies of the world, DC, etc. Now, they find that working class men not simply reacting to changes in the economy, family norms, or religious organizations. Rather, they're doing even more. They're trying to renegotiate their relationships to these institutions by attempting to construct autonomous, generative selves. Now, that's a lot of big words in one sentence, but what is an important backdrop, much like what we saw in Tuesday's content, is it's not just low income men who have seen a difference in how they father, what it means to be a good father, how they show up differently than the way they were parented. This is part of social trends, right? We see social trends at large changing how people, men in this instance, relate to things like the economy, to families, to religion, what have you. Now, in the men they studied, they found that actually there wasn't just a renegotiation of what good and bad or right and wrong meant in those realms, but actually also too how men related to these concepts, how they conceived of their identity and their masculinity in relation to social institutions that had typically formed the basis of how they interpreted themselves and one another. Um, Now, there was a real emphasis on autonomy and generativity. Now, autonomy has come up before: agency, personal choice, being able to choose and move as you will with your personal compass as kind of the guide, instead of being forced or having closed opportunities, etc. Generativity is a word that we haven't come across yet, and it doesn't really get a lot of shout outs. It's kind of a fancy word for generation, or rather, the work we do that contributes to those who come next. Obviously, fathers are huge in contributing to the next generation, both, you know, initially and then in time. But there was almost a decoupling from fatherhood as provider and fatherhood as mentor or teacher. And there was an emphasis placed on the latter, as the chances to express the former role as provider fell away, if they were ever there at all, right? Because we know that these men are being born generations into economies that have been stagnant at best. Now, this desire to guide and nurture the next generation really manifested when they showed both a detachment from the institutions like work and engaged with more autonomous forms of work, child rearing, and spirituality, often with an emphasis on generativity. So, in the case of single mothers, we saw that the meaning derived from bringing life into this world, already a huge, huge source of meaning for life givers. It is something that becomes all the more special in the complete dearth or absence of anything comparable to that. Really, any other opportunities, but especially something so powerful. This is it. For fathers, while they still can be fathers, they can still partner and be in relationship and be in that role. Their ability to express the markers of being a good father have never really been fully available to them. For example, that role of provider, being able to know that you put the food on the table, put the food in the bellies, that is actually very, very tenuous at best, even for their own bellies, right? Let alone more mouths to feed. And in some ways, if you were to measure your ability to be a good father by your ability to financially provide for your children, there would be many fathers who would never be able to call themselves a good father. And so instead, we saw a real detachment where being a good father is still very much about paying it forward and guiding and nurturing the next generation, but it's not necessarily as straightforward as father as provider, breadwinner in those kind of more contemporary but also increasingly historical conceptions. Now, they go on to explain that essentially this desire for generative work may represent a wish to help young people avoid the difficulties they perceive themselves to have experienced while growing up. The act of helping others may be a form of self healing for many of them. Although they themselves may bear scars, they say it stops here, it ends with me. And so they actually found that, not only were fathers kind of reshaping how they showed up in the lives of their children, but they continued to seek out, or they really sought out work, or even placed a higher value on work that allowed them to really feel like they were tangibly intervening or breaking that cycle. Um, and in some cases, there was a small irony that there were men who maybe weren't involved in the day to day of their children for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes, even though the fathers wanted to kind of decouple providing from fatherhood, still a pretty strict requirement on the mom's side. And so sometimes dads couldn't see their kids if they weren't paying the mother what she felt was appropriate. And they would instead find ways to express that desire to nurture and guide through work, through affiliations, through things that maybe aren't formal employment, maybe it's under the table, or maybe it's being able to just show up on the street corner and have a social exchange that allows them to still feel like they're contributing in that way. And perhaps, someday when their children are of age, they can seek them out and they'll have that ability to help them because they were building those skills the whole time. Now, this isn't to say they didn't feel that fathers should be providing for their children economically, but that the sense of responsibility could be negated in cases where the custodial parent would not let them see their children. Furthermore, men who did not live with their children often conceived of themselves as helpers rather than providers financially. So, in this dynamic, right, the things that they were able to contribute were always good. There was never oh, there's not enough because I'm not the end all be all. Whatever I bring is bonus. It's help. I know the mom's got it. And so she's never expecting more than I can give. Uh, or at least they can have a narrative that allows them to understand their ability to show up only in certain ways as still being enough. Because again, just because fatherhood looks different, feels different, it doesn't mean it's not still deeply meaningful and wasn't something that uh, individuals in all communities still continue to seek out and find deep meaning in. But in the absence of opportunities otherwise, fathers have a somewhat stickier relationship with it because the way we typically have conceived of fatherhood involves that provider component. Now, nearly all of the men they spoke to viewed father child as central, while the partner relationship was more peripheral. But the success of the men's attempts to renegotiate family life were often contingent on the cooperation of the children's mothers. So, for example, like I said, just like fathers may have decoupled the expectation to provide, being a a precondition to their access to their children, that's not necessarily something that moms may be similarly motivated to accept. And actually, what if it's not so much about the ability to provide as the relationship status? They found that often the relationship status between the mother and father hugely predicted paternal involvement in the lives of children. Uh, Moral commentary aside, the mothers, as the primary custodial parent, were the gatekeepers of access to the child. And if access to the child is predicated on either providing emotional or relational resources, and neither of these things are happening, the mother is able to cut off access. And fathers really found themselves seeking out sources and ways to still be able to express their paternal involvement, but it was still, in many ways, a second order concern to what was happening between them and the mom, or them and the economy, or both, right? If we think of the marriageable man pool and the hypothesis that in some ways it is actually a direct reflection of their economic prospects, that they flounder in relationships. There's no way to decouple the two. Now, in some ways, the optimistic reading of the developments we've described is that working class men are now sharing in the autonomy and generativity that was largely the province of middle and upper class men in previous generations. Right? These things aren't bad. If anything, it's adding to the ways they can express fatherhood, because father as provider is a very specific modality. But if you wanted to perhaps have a more pessimistic reading, it's that these men are pursuing goals that they're unlikely to achieve due to their lack of social integration. Without social support, their chances of success diminish. Those who fail to achieve the autonomous, generative selves they crave will have little to fall back on and few people to prevent them from sinking into despair. In a lot of ways, what we see now in really disadvantaged communities, both urban and rural, is an epidemic of despair, an inability to hope and dream because your life experience has been so deadening that it shows you that those things are actually dangerous. Uh, Despair, in all its many forms, is right. It's not just a reflection of kind of your economic outcomes or your educational opportunities. It is also a reflection of your intimate relationships, both between partners and between parent and child. And this is not just a low income or working class phenomenon. Everyone's life is interconnected, and what you do on the outside comes home with you. What you live with goes into the classroom, goes into the workplace with you. But if you have essentially been stymied and blocked from opportunities to express yourself economically, educationally, otherwise, and fatherhood remains your only opportunity, you can see how it's slightly more complicated than the mothers and their ability to still draw deep meaning from this role, even as marriage falls away, even as, right, they often wind up being a single parent. It operates differently for many, many reasons for fathers and mothers. But at the end of the day, we know that if I could bring it back to Kathy Edin's point, at the end of the day, it doesn't actually take much away from the life of the mothers and fathers, but to be born into homes where not only resources, physical, economic, are short, in short supply, but we also know that, like, developmentally, right? To be a teenage parent means to be a life giver and to be a provider responsible for another being before your frontal lobe has finished developing. All of you guys, unless you're 25 and up, you're still growing. You're all this. It's crazy to think if you're neurodivergent, could keep growing even longer. There's other things that can just, like, your brain isn't fully developed. And, like, in some ways, and this is where we kind of will conclude, we have to appreciate the choices of parents, but also be able to intervene on behalf of children in some ways, because all else being equal, having a teenage parent is typically associated with more negative outcomes across the life course, and it starts prenatal, right? We also know that having just one parent in the household, whether it's just mom or just dad, leads to less. Even though we know there are many parents who do the most to make sure that's not the case for their children in their home, it is a striking social phenomenon that we see certain family patterns persist in America in ways that we don't in other quote unquote developed nations. And as much as we want to intervene through policy, marriage, child rearing, in some ways, you could say these are some of the most potent choices any of us will make in our lives. And they're also the hardest and arguably the stickiest to try and intervene because they're deeply cultural. They're deeply personal. They're informed by things above and beyond structure, even though we know structure is going to dictate how things unfold at every step of the way. So I hope with this week, what you take from the content as we kind of look to our rest of the semester is how, if we're looking at urban inequality as a phenomenon, that we want to intervene and we want to make things more equitable. Maybe it will never completely go away, but what would we want? What levers, what strings, what things could we provide? What supports could we build that would change what is happening? It's obviously not as simple as giving people more money. It's not as simple as having more jobs. It's not as simple as having better housing. It's not as simple as having better schools. Because we know at the end of the day, people will make their choices. They will still love and lose and birth and die. But, like, these things are all social, they all go together. And so, in some ways, when we impact those things that we do have control over, maybe downstream, maybe we will see impacts on the rest of it. But in America, we culturally find ourselves more often than not asking questions and pointing the finger at cultural things rather than the structural kind of junctures that we could actually impact. And sometimes it's because of framing. It's because, certain things just sound better in a soundbite. A lot of it has to do with racism and discrimination. And so as we take some time away from this class, I hope you'll kind of let this percolate. And when we come back together, we're going to kind of be tying these things up in the sense of we know how it started. We don't know how it will end, but, like, where do all these things kind of lead? And so when we come back together, we're going to be jumping into incarceration and what that looks like as both a cause and consequence of everything we've studied up until now. And so what I'm going to do is we're all done with content formally. Thank you guys for Zoom participation this week. I know it's not as fun when we're all together, but next time we come back, we will be. So keep your eyes peeled for any announcements about that after spring break. If you have requests about quizzes, please just send me an email right now and I will be resetting those. Any other questions, follow up accordingly. There will be probably radio silence after Sunday in respect of spring break, but you'll also see an announcement for that extra credit evaluation opportunity. So you'll see that all by Sunday. Be in touch if you have questions. I'm going to conclude now. Not really going to have office hours today, but I will stay on just for a couple minutes. If you have a quick one, yes, no question, I can answer. But you're all free to go. Safe travels wherever you go for spring break. Take care and be well. Bye. Thank you guys.
Bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you. You too.